We wasn't even on the highway yet. We were on the entrance ramp. And Chucky looked in the rearview and was like, "Put your head down, I think somebody following us." And then from there, it was just shots.
Bro, stop! Keep driving, bro.
And then the glass breaking, tires screeching, almost replays almost daily.
Get off the exit. Chuck, you straight? Somebody grab that wheel. Chuck, you straight? Oh, go. Man, Chuck shot.
When they tell me 911.
Hey, listen, please. We got a shooting.
What's the address?
I'm in front of the exit of Jimmy Carter. We're on the highway. We on the side of the road. Right, baby, we here. We here, Chuck. We here.
Hey, Chuck.
Chuck, you do this.
I think we need to start something.
Please, man.
Hey,
Save my dog, man.
Go ahead.
Save my dog, man. Hey, stay with me.
For those most affected by a homicide,
I still listen to his music. It still gives me a sense of his presence.
the first 48 is just the beginning.
Nobody had any idea who the shooter was. No leads. No leads.
This is the story of the fight for justice.
There won't be any fingerprints, there won't be any DNA. None of that will be involved in this case.
In the weeks, months, and years.
I knew this was a case that could be lost.
The guy was transported to the hospital. He was dead on arrival.
When I arrived on scene, I knew I had my work cut out for me. But one step leads to another step, and it just kind of expands. And that's how we work to find justice for the victim.
33-year-old Corey DeTiche was a Houston-based rapper known by the stage name Chucky Trill. He's survived by his wife of 3.5 years.
Car got sprayed. You're looking at 1, 2, 3.
The Suburban was shot 8 times. Chucky was struck in the thigh and abdomen.
There were bullet holes from the front, headlight area, all along the driver's side, and it stopped at the rear door.
But there's no shell casings, there's very little evidence. So it was frustrating, you know, not much out there. Driver's the victim?
Yeah.
We have more guys back there.
None of everybody else in the car gets hit.
According to the passengers, they were driving down the highway when another vehicle opened fire.
If no one's armed, it tells me a lot. They're not going to confront anybody, and they're really not expecting any trouble.
We're going to transport to headquarters and find out what the story is.
Okay. 2 hours in.
It really depended on someone knowing the backstory of the victim. Do you know anybody that might want to hurt the victim? Were you engaged in any activities that might have led to the victim's death?
Dorminey and Dunning start with one of the backseat passengers.
What's your name? LaSalle Smith. LaSalle. Big Sal. Big Sal? Yes, sir. Okay. He's on my label.
So you're kind of promoting him, I guess.
Yes, sir. And we supposed to be here doing something.
He says he, Chucky, and another rapper, 20 Glock, just flew in that night. It's NBA All-Star Weekend in Atlanta, and they came to promote Chucky's album.
We went to the first club. I can't remember the name, but that's where we met. The tall, skinny dude. That's from here. He's from Atlanta. I've never seen him till today.
Okay. Does he have a nickname? What did you call him?
For what I heard, Dirty Red.
So at some point, Dirty Red, who is an associate of Chucky's, ends up getting into the SUV with them, and then they go to Miami Lounge.
So we was all there until at least 2:30. Then we left. And so we got in the car. Chucky was driving, and I just remember we was coming down the ramp. And I remember him speeding up. Then I heard a pop. Went pop. I'm like, what is that? And I turned my head, it popped again, and I seen a flash from the muzzle and the glass broke. So we jumped down to the ground then, and we were screaming like, keep going, because we was, in my mind, I'm thinking like, if we stop, they gonna hop out and just go spray the car and finish us.
He says Chucky was hit and losing consciousness. so 20 Glock grabbed the wheel and stopped the SUV.
Okay. Did you see the car at all? So let me ask you this, why would anybody follow him?
I really don't know, sir.
Chucky didn't have any issues with anybody, or?
There was no beefs at all. No, sir.
As a detective, you're sitting here thinking, you've only been in Atlanta for 6 to 8 hours, and the vehicle you're driving in gets shot up. Something happened. Something put this into motion.
I'm sure you would tell me if that was the case, right? Okay.
Because I was scared for my life at this point.
Absolutely. And Chucky lost his life. You didn't know that? He's passed away.
I didn't want to believe it.
That's a normal reaction. It tells me that he's probably telling me everything that he knows. He's not trying to hold back anything. So that's the kind of reaction I want to see. Well, I'll tell you what, I'm going to give you a second here, and we're going to go talk to the others, okay?
Oh, but...
Hey, D'Angelo.
Dorminey and Dunning now turned to 20 Glock.
Why do y'all suspect something like this was going to happen?
As far as I know, like, it seemed like a setup. I got an itchy vibe when that dude that's, I guess, live here, rolled with us. I just didn't feel right around him. Just based on what he said and what I saw tonight.
He thinks Dirty Red may have been involved in the shooting. Chucky had introduced him to the group that night.
I feel like it was set up. When we was at the club, I noticed he said, "Who ride in the front seat?" So as we go to the club, we leave, we come out, he's sitting there very, very back this time. And it seemed like when all they went down, like it went directly aimed towards the front.
Dirty Red was a stranger to the group. There was no issues leading up to leaving the club.
So if anybody was in cahoots with the suspect, it would have been Dirty Red because he's a new guy.
And where Dirty Red was in the back seat of the SUV, there were no bullet holes.
So getting back to the shooting on the highway, car, truck, SUV.
It was more definitely his car.
Okay. What color was the car?
Probably gray.
So in your mind, this must have been some sort of planned event?
It had to be planned.
The fact that Dirty Red might have been involved started weighing on me, but it's very hard to go in there with a strategy to get that out of him when I myself don't know the details. How much do you know about what happened?
I hosted an event tonight at Living Room, and Chucky was like, "Come with me, I'm gonna go. I got another, it's another artist." We had to be there for about an hour and a half, maybe 2 hours. Walked out the club, get in the car. He like, "What strip club's popping?" I'm like, "I don't even know what's over here."
I wasn't comfortable with some of the answers we got from Dirty Red. This last second of him hopping into the SUV made me feel there's a possibility that he had involvement.
So who would set up this guy?
I don't know.
If this was some sort of a hit, could there have been a communication between him and somebody in the back seat? And maybe that's why the bullet holes lined up the way that they did.
I can't tell you who targeted this.
This is our first picture when Chucky was incarcerated. It may look like we're side by side, but he's behind the glass. I met Chucky when he was incarcerated with my brother. So for 2.5 years, we had just been talking through the glass. One time we were able to sneak a kiss. Then I'm like, I love him even more. It was a good feeling though, great feeling.
Chucky served 8 years for assault with a deadly weapon. After he got out of prison, he turned his life around by focusing on his music.
Here's a picture after one of his performances. Chucky wasn't a troublemaker. He didn't have any enemies. His image may portray to someone that he's this hardcore gangster, but if you knew Chucky Trill, you knew that he was a sweet, loving, gentle teddy bear. That's why at the hospital, when I found out that Chucky was killed, I still couldn't believe it. I've never been through a pain like this. I wish he was still here.
Four hours into the investigation.
So if I had to focus on something, who would I focus on? Who would you tell me to focus on? The car shot up pretty good, okay? So someone wanted to kill somebody, okay? I want to see him deny it to the T, essentially, that no, that's crazy, I didn't have anything to do with it. So let's just say your group was targeted tonight. Who do you think was the one that was going to be targeted? You think it was Chucky?
But I really don't know. I can't tell you who, or even give you an inclination of who it could be.
Okay, let's go to that car. What did you see?
They hit, got the off the highway, and you only seen the tail lights.
All right. He stayed steady. He denied having any kind of arrangement with anybody to have this done.
The whole interview was in a accusatory cloud over me. It felt like, did y'all do it? Did y'all have something to do with it?
I thought we were gonna have something with him, but he's cool as a cucumber in there. He wasn't nervous. He wasn't trying to hide nothing. I didn't have enough information really to call his bluff if he's bluffing. I just didn't.
The team rules out Dirty Red and lets the witnesses go.
I was really in autopilot. I didn't do anything until I got home. When I took my clothes off and when I realized you got the blood on you, that's when the tears came. Everything just broke down. So for you to even think that I could have a part in my best friend's murder is beyond me.
After going through all the interviews and not getting any information at all, where do we go next?
Nobody had any idea who the shooter was. No leads. So I was not very confident about the outcome of this case.
What are they saying as far as the purple vehicle?
We have no 78 on a vehicle except for his silver. But they went to 2 clubs. So basically, Club Miami. We'll get in there and see if we can't get video.
8 hours in.
All right, so just play this one.
Corporal Hardin has collected surveillance footage from the Miami Hookah Lounge.
So everybody gets out of the club. This is your victim.
We can see Chucky and his entourage. We're looking at the people that are around him to see if anybody's following him, to see if anybody's acting not normal.
This is your victim vehicle right here, the Suburban. And they walk to their vehicle. Victim vehicle leaves.
What I'm looking for is a possible silver or gray sedan.
Right here.
The dark charcoal or dark gray car.
Within a few seconds, that silver vehicle follows Chucky's SUV out of the parking lot for the club in the direction of the interstate.
Go back.
That's the vehicle right here? Yeah.
The same car entered the lot 20 minutes before Chucky left the club.
From the time it enters the parking lot until the time it leaves. At no time did anyone get out of the vehicle. So that's suspect already.
And then once our victim's vehicle starts up and takes off, they back out and they follow him.
It looks, and actually was, a stalking. I mean, he was hunting his prey. Me knowing what is gonna happen, you can feel the tension in the air. It is like a lion on a hunt.
This is the entrance of the club. It's called I Lounge. We used to perform at this spot. This is where we met. The first time I really got a chance to link and get to know who Chucky was as an artist. I became a fan here. When me and him hit the stage, I would feed off of his energy. Anytime we performed, it was fun, it was electrifying. When we were together, two peas in a pod. You couldn't break us apart. That's my partner. That was my brother. This place was a start. Definitely a start. We had a lot of memories here. We always had this motto, right or wrong, we gonna make it home. We've been through a lot of situations, and we always walked out. And it was like this one was the one I walked out by myself. I ain't like that feeling.
The 11 hours since Chucky's shooting death.
These guys came here and waited on him. That's straight up hit.
I need to find out a motive, a relationship between the victim and the suspect.
See, looks like a BMW to me.
I just need a tag.
The team can't make out the plate number.
Using Flock, which is a license plate reader system.
We needed to check some cameras that capture license plates of vehicles as they go through intersections.
If you give me a few minutes, I might be able to come up with it.
Then, as news of Chucky's murder spreads.
So what was going on in his life that would warrant someone doing something like this to him?
That's what I wanted to talk about.
A tipster comes forward.
So he was, I would say like a middleman between like drug trafficking.
According to the tipster, Chucky made extra money selling cocaine to a man from Detroit.
So last year, back in July, the guy came to Houston. Well, this time the distributor didn't have any drugs. So Chucky contacted somebody else.
On this particular day, they were meeting some new providers, so to speak.
So they met up with these two people. Chucky gets in the backseat.
Chucky was in the car negotiating with these individuals.
And now they're dealing with $80,000.
But Detroit, he didn't want to dally around too much. He just wanted to pay these guys the money and get his drugs.
And he threw the money to the guy front seat. He threw his lap.
Detroit tossed the 80 grand to the new suppliers before Chucky had the drugs.
And the car drove off with the money and Chucky, went down the street, stopped, got out, pistol whipped Chucky, and had him walk back to where Detroit was.
He was like, man, they robbed me. Chucky had a necklace that he still had on his neck. And Detroit's like, well, why didn't they take your chain if they robbed you?
Detroit probably thought that Chucky was complicit in this drug transaction where he was ripped off.
2 weeks later, Chucky got a call from someone he knew.
He told me, man, somebody just came up to me and offered me $10,000 to kill you. Chucky, he paid Detroit back half of his money. He owed him like $35,000.
Okay, and you don't know his real name?
No. His nickname is Leg. I think they call him because he doesn't have legs. I guess he was hit by a train.
Is it double amputee or?
Mm-hmm. He has fake legs.
everything changed on a dime. I went from really feeling not good about the case to thinking that we were getting close to knowing who did it.
Before Dorminey can follow up on Legs,
as soon as I found this, I brought it up to you.
results from the license plate readers come in.
I ran all BMW silver, gray on a flock.
We see this gray BMW go through the intersection up there near 85 and Indian Trail,
which is close to Miami Lounge, around the time of the homicide.
They compare the images from Flock to the video from the Miami Hookah Lounge.
Yeah, that's the car.
There you go.
Then on the front of it, there is a tag.
Pulled history of the vehicle.
90 minutes earlier, at 1 a.m., the same BMW also hit near the first club that Chucky went to.
I conducted a search on the vehicle registration and the driver's license.
James Thomas.
I just remember getting that return and pops on my screen that on his driver's license there's a restriction.
Prosthetic aids required.
That's
on his
because
license.
he's a double amputee. That's legs.
I looked at Dunning and I said, this is it. This is our suspect.
Well, I'll be. He allegedly goes by the nickname Legs, also goes by Detroit.
Your heart rate goes up, the adrenaline is pumping. I immediately shout out to Dorminey that all the information that the tipster gave us is 100% spot on.
34-year-old James Thomas served 2 years for accessory after the fact and felony possession of a firearm.
So I got his Instagram, says he's a musician.
A rapper with the moniker Legs Diamond. He and his girlfriend are expecting a son.
I was happy because we had a suspect, I had a motive, but I don't reach out to the DA's office at that point because I just haven't developed enough probable cause for an arrest.
That's his address on his license.
What about the phone number? Doesn't he have a phone number on his license?
He does. We can run it to figure out.
Let's see it. Let's run it.
What we're trying to do is put them there at the scene. So the plan is to get cell phone records. We knew that was Legs' vehicle. Now you're looking to put his digital devices there, phones, iPads. You could say, yeah, I lent my car to this individual that night. Well, did you lend that individual your phone to? Not likely.
It's exciting to start to put those pieces of the puzzle together. Now we just got to prove it.
Almost 4 months later,
I got my geofence here, I got my Google response, I got the tower dump.
Dorminey gets location history for James Thomas's cell phone.
You can see him at the living room. He's there about an hour. He moves there, goes up to a club in Norcross, Miami Lounge. This is it right here. And that's at 2:36 in the morning. 2:45, he's killed now. At 2:49, 2:51, and it starts moving down. So literally, it actually puts him on the highway when the shooting takes place. You have got a net that is just getting tighter and tighter around Legs. Got motive, pictures, and digital evidence.
The team now has enough to charge James Thomas with Chucky's murder.
It's a good win for us. It's a good win for Chucky's family. And now we're looking to make an arrest.
So he's got a lot to answer for. We'll kind of pass it on to our fugitive unit and get him.
See if he won't come in and talk to me about it.
After a month and a half of searching,
Yes. They gave me a call and said, hey, we got him. He was arrested at the Atlanta airport.
You know, what am I wanted for? I ain't dropped murder yet. I just said aggravated assault. He's like, well, I ain't never been in Gwinnett County.
Dorminey heads over to the jailhouse to interview Legs.
He didn't even give me that chance. He looked at me up and down. He said, I know who the you are and I ain't talking to you. I'm going to talk to my attorney.
Anytime you were able to make an arrest, it's a good feeling. And now we look to get a successful prosecution through courts.
I was worried when I initially got this case because there were no eyewitnesses who could say James Thomas was there.
When you're dealing with a case that is based on circumstantial evidence, the jury may find themselves wanting more. We had to show the motive.
He told me, somebody just came up to me and offered me $10,000 for Julian.
The motive came from this drug deal gone bad, but no one knew who gave the police the information, other than the police and our office.
The tipster's identity had been concealed for their safety.
We did eventually speak to them about a week prior to the trial.
Who was the tipster?
That person was Cherish Detige, who was Chucky Chill's wife.
When he told me that he needed me to testify, I instantly told him no. I was like, can you just use the footage from my initial interview with Detective Dorminey?
The chances were astronomically against us winning without Cherish's testimony. Without her, the conviction wouldn't happen.
I was scared to testify. I was definitely scared that someone would want to retaliate and something could happen to me.
Cherish's dilemma was this. Her husband would not get justice without her. But if James Thomas were to be acquitted, he could be free to enact revenge on her. That's a hard choice.
Cherish has only a week to decide if she'll testify. As the trial of James Thomas begins.
James Thomas's digital fingerprints are all over this case. At the end of this, you're going to be convinced that James Thomas was a party to this crime.
So let's talk about what the evidence is. There won't be any fingerprints, there won't be any DNA. None of that will be involved in this case. You will not see any person in this case say they saw James Thomas that night. And that's important.
After opening arguments,
Will you raise your right hand?
Cherish takes the stand.
I wanted Leg to answer for the decisions that he made.
She found the courage, and she did agree to testify. Did Corey say what they did to him while he was in that car?
Corey said that they took the bag that contained the 2 bricks of cocaine.
She knew the entire drug story as the deal happened. She was the source of the motive, fully and completely through her. Did Corey tell you what happened? What did he tell you?
He told me he was wrong.
And what did he say about Legs the next day?
He was worried. Corey was worried.
Okay, what did he tell you?
You gotta get him his money back. I was trying so hard to keep my composure. It was just like reliving the whole situation over again. Sorry. It was heartbreaking.
But overall, she did well. If motive is established, especially in a case like this, you're a long way towards getting a guilty verdict.
But on Nicole Fagan's cross-examination,
Your testimony is that he's in the vehicle drives off, and he's pistol whipped, right?
Correct.
But Chucky didn't have any busted lip, right?
Correct.
No indication of being pistol whipped, correct?
Correct.
No indication of there being a robbery besides what he told you, right?
Correct. She wanted to make me out to be this liar, make my story be unbelievable.
So ultimately, you weren't there and you don't know who shot Chucky, right?
Correct.
I was concerned that Nicole Fagan had created reasonable doubt as to whether Cherish was a credible witness.
So finding another way to substantiate that story about the Houston drug deal gone bad is critical. It's critical.
It turned out that there was a second person who could give us more information about the motive for the murder.
He told me that 20 went to purchase a razor blade to cut the 2 bricks of cocaine open to make sure that it was real.
And who is 20?
20 is Corey's friend.
20 Glock was at the Houston drug deal.
As far as I know, It seemed like a setup.
He was there to back up Chucky. So the thing 20 Glock could do that Cherish could not do was establish that Legs was at that scene.
But you never know what's going to happen when a witness actually takes the stand.
Do you see anybody from that day in the courtroom?
If I'm mistaken him, I just remember Tron. That's all I remember is dude named Tron.
He kept talking about some other guy named Tron who was also bald, like James Thomas. Okay, I'm not asking a name. I'm asking, do you recognize anyone in the courtroom from that day?
I'm mistaken, I think I saw him, but I don't really recall.
20 Glock had a serious case of amnesia. He was suddenly very confused.
Your testimony now is that you never even saw Legs there, right?
I really don't know who that guy is.
Okay. You're not aware, are you aware of any drug deal that happened in Houston?
If it was a drug deal, it was done under my nose, but I don't recall no drug deal.
When 20 Glock did not come through with his testimony, that's understandable because given the situation, he's scared.
Unfortunately, I would consider his testimony a win for the defense.
Thank you. Please be seated.
When you have a bad witness, it's commonly said that you generated a stank. But what we did have was electronic data. And that's what the case was going to depend on.
But cell phone data, geofencing, it's not sexy. It's not something that the jury is used to hearing.
A geofence is basically a search warrant using a geographical area with a time parameter.
I saw a glazed over look on the jury's faces.
And that's where I got the subscriber information.
I think it just went over their heads. Even I was confused.
And so you're losing people, and that never bodes well for the prosecution.
Is that what you supplied the victim?
Yes.
Adding to John Nichols' stress.
I noticed symptoms throughout the week that were atypical for me. Now, the final thing we're going to discuss here, I was having gaps in memory. I wasn't retaining things like I could. At that point, I didn't know what was happening. Then on the last day of testimony, my chest started getting tighter and tighter. My breath became shorter and shorter.
You could see that he was a little clammy. He just didn't look right.
Your Honor, let me approach. Sure. I wrote a note at that point to the judge that I was having tightness in my chest and I just needed a break.
Hey, can you get EMS in here?
He had all the symptoms of having a heart attack. So very, very upsetting.
The first thing that flashed through my head is, I hope John's okay. And the very next thing was, what are we going to do with this trial?
In many respects, I'm lucky.
Doctors find that Nichols didn't have a heart attack. Instead, his blood pressure had spiked.
Lucky that it wasn't worse, but I knew the trial might continue without me, and I was a little concerned about that.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I hope you enjoyed your lunch.
That decision is up to the judge.
So unfortunately, this case cannot go forward, and I granted a motion for a mistrial.
I'm thinking in my head that a mistrial means that everything is over and he's gonna be getting out.
A mistrial means that we'll pick up from the very beginning of the trial on a different date. A mistrial can be a good thing or it can be a bad thing.
But I did not have high hopes for the second time. The second time was going to be a battle.
So the state offers James Thomas a plea deal, voluntary manslaughter, and 15 years in prison.
He did not take that deal. He was not interested in it at all.
If you're not willing to take a plea, then you definitely feel like you're gonna beat this.
They were very confident about their case.
For both the prosecution and defense.
Hey man,
The retrial will be handled by new teams with new tactics.
It started with the feedback from the prior jury.
They felt it was taking too long for the full picture to come into focus.
But we did get a second chance, essentially, at it, to try a new strategy.
All right, who was the first civilian?
Pretty sure that was Cherish.
Right.
I wanted to get fewer exhibits, condense the case down to fewer witnesses, and right after we set the crime scene, I believe we moved on to Cherish to give the motive.
I was ready to give it a crack.
Months later.
Good afternoon. Good afternoon.
Cherish once again must face Chucky's alleged killer.
He looked directly at me, and I didn't feel nervous or scared.
You see anyone in the courtroom that could be him?
Yes, sir.
Where?
Sitting there at the table. It was just like, this is the person who I know killed my husband.
But to prove motive, the state needs to put James Thomas at the scene of the Houston drug deal, which Cherish still can't do. And the one person who can.
So you never even saw Legs there, right?
I really don't know who the guy is.
It got so bad, he kept backing off his story. We decided not to call him as a witness for the retrial.
But what we do have is we have James Thomas's cell phone.
It was with him when he was arrested, same phone.
Below the IMEI number 2, what does that say?
Location services enabled, and it says true.
And it established that he was in Houston at the place and the time that Cherish related in her story.
What is in the green box?
That would be a message that was sent from the defendant's phone.
As we started investigating the data that was on his actual phone, we also found the text that talked about how he wanted to kill Chucky Trill.
Okay, and could you read that into the record?
When I get Trill gone, I'm gone.
When I get Trill gone,
I'm gone.
In other words, once he got Chucky killed, he was going to leave Houston. That's a direct threat on Chucky Trill's life. And I think that particular point was very persuasive to the jury.
But during the defense's closing, they immediately went to the lack of evidence.
You have to decide if proof beyond a reasonable doubt is a case where there is no murder weapon, there is no eyewitness.
So I knew this was a case that could be lost.
During your deliberation, you must not communicate with anyone other than your fellow jurors.
After 8 hours.
Has the jury reached its verdict?
Yes.
Okay, if you would hand that to Patty.
When they announced it, my whole body shook, like I was that nervous.
It only took maybe 5 seconds for her to read it, but this is the longest 5 seconds of your life.
Count 1, malice murder. We, the jury, find the defendant guilty.
I just, I dropped my head. It was just like a big sense of relief.
It was bittersweet. I was happy to get justice. I was not happy to see another man go into the system.
Before the sentencing.
On the early morning of March 5th, 2021, your actions ripped my heart apart.
Cherish addresses Chucky's killer.
How will I live on without my husband? He had plans. We had plans. You took a part of me that I can never get back.
James Thomas's fate is now in the hands of the judge.
Count 1, malice murder. I'm sentencing you to life without the possibility of parole. Count 3, aggravated assault. I'm sentencing you to 20 years.
The judge sentenced James Thomas to life plus 105 years. And after the trial, as is his right, James Thomas was given a chance to speak.
I sympathize greatly for them. My condolences.
I can't bring their son back, but I did not take their son. Like, I'm innocent and I don't feel like justice was served at all.
He definitely showed no remorse. He didn't care. I feel like he's where he should be. And I hope it remains that way.
Years after Chucky's death.
What's up with it? This your boy Chucky Tria, and right now y'all about to check out my new single.
His widow and his best friend keep his memory alive.
A lot of the pictures we have together was taken right here. This was performed here.
Is it tough to look at those?
Very much so. Haven't been here since. Chucky took a part of me when he left. That's why I wear sunglasses. I have to hide the pain. I have to hide the pain.
Even though it's been, a while since he's been gone, I still listen to his music, especially the songs that he dedicated to me. It still gives me a sense of his presence. And I'll just smile and I'll say, I miss you too, baby. Or I love you too, baby. Because it just makes me feel like he's thinking of me and I'm thinking of him too.
The body had been left on Kilvert Street. It was June 20th, 1987. Warwick, Rhode Island. A woman named Rhonda Lee Travers was dead. And whoever had killed her was gone. There was no courtroom answer waiting. No confession. No final explanation. Only a body, an abandoned trail of questions, and a city that had already begun to fear that something much darker was happening. Rhonda had last been seen in Providence. Her life was complicated. She was known to struggle with drug use and prostitution. Those facts would become part of the investigation, but they should never have defined the value of her life. She was still a daughter, still a human being. Still someone whose disappearance should have mattered. On that June morning, the discovery of her body turned a missing person mystery into a homicide investigation. The location was Kilvert Street in Warwick. Industrial surroundings. Roads. Vehicles. Places where people could come and go without attracting much attention. And that created a problem. A killer did not necessarily need to know Rhonda. A killer could have crossed paths with her. A vehicle could have carried her away. A brief encounter could have become fatal. The investigators had to reconstruct a sequence that nobody had witnessed from beginning to end. Where had Rhonda been? Who had seen her? How had she reached Warwick? Who had driven her there? And most importantly, who had killed her? Those questions would remain unanswered for decades. The case would eventually become part of a larger pattern. Because Rhonda was not the only woman murdered in Warwick during that period. 9 months earlier, another young woman had been killed. Her name was Kathy Perry. Kathy was 20 years old. On September 14th, 1986, she had been driving to work at Ultra Finishers, a bookbinding company in Warwick. Her mother, Marilyn, happened to see her while they were both driving. They exchanged a wave. It was an ordinary moment. A mother seeing her daughter on the road. Nothing about it suggested that Kathy was about to disappear. But later that night, Kathy never returned home. Her abandoned vehicle was eventually found. Her body was discovered behind Arlington Trailer Sales on Quaker Lane. The two cases were different, but investigators eventually saw a disturbing similarity. Both women had been killed in Warwick. Both had been found away from where they were last seen. Both cases went unsolved. And the city was left wondering whether the two murders were connected. Then came Rhonda. June 1987. Kilvert Street. Another woman dead. Another investigation. Another family forced to live with unanswered questions. The fear was not limited to one neighborhood. People knew something was wrong. 2 women had been murdered within months. And the killer or killers had not been identified. The years that followed were unforgiving. Investigators pursued leads. Names surfaced. Suspects were considered. Information was evaluated. Some people were ruled out. Others could not be connected to the crimes. And eventually the cases became cold. Cold did not mean forgotten. It meant unresolved. The files remained. The memories remained. The questions remained. But active investigations eventually become old investigations. Detectives retire. New officers arrive. Priorities change. Resources move elsewhere. And the people who originally knew every detail of a case eventually leave the department. That is what happened in Warwick. The murders of Kathy Perry and Rhonda Travers faded from the center of public attention. But they never disappeared completely. Years later, Warwick Police Sergeant Fred Pierce became involved in the city's cold cases. He had spent decades in law enforcement. He eventually became responsible for long-standing, unsolved homicides. There were many. Some were connected to organized crime. Others had different circumstances. But Kathy's case stayed with him. And then something happened that changed the investigation. A phone call. Not a dramatic confession. Not a mysterious cassette. A phone call from an informant. The informant was connected to the Rhode Island Department of Corrections. Chief Inspector Robert Bob Catlow had heard about Pierce's work on Kathy's case. He told Pierce that a longtime informant at the adult correctional institutions was willing to provide information. The informant claimed to know who had killed Kathy. Then came the name. Pierce referred to the person only as Stanley. It was not the suspect's real name. Pierce deliberately used a pseudonym when discussing him publicly. But the name was not entirely unfamiliar. Several years earlier, a West Warwick detective had already mentioned Stanley to Pierce after Kathy's case received renewed attention. The detective believed Stanley might be worth examining.
Why?
Because Stanley had previously been convicted of manslaughter in another cold case. The case involved Cheryl Johnson. Pierce had looked at the possibility. At that time, he had not been convinced that Stanley was responsible for Kathy's murder. So the lead went nowhere. Years passed. Then the informant brought the name back. This time, Pierce listened differently. The information concerned a suspect who had apparently never been fully investigated in connection with Kathy's murder. And now the detective had a reason to look again. He began digging into Stanley's history. The old case. The old conviction. The timeline. The locations. The connections. The details that had seemed insignificant years earlier suddenly deserved another examination. That is the nature of a cold case. A fact does not necessarily change. The meaning of the fact can change. A name can sit in a file for decades. A detective can dismiss it. Another detective can read the same name years later and see something completely different. That possibility is what kept Warwick's investigation alive. But Rhonda Travers remained at the center of another unresolved question. Was the same person responsible for both murders? The possibility had been considered. The circumstances created similarities. Both women had been found dead in Warwick. Both cases had remained unresolved. And decades later, investigators were looking again. The renewed investigation did not simply reopen old files. It brought new strategies, new interviews, new information, new ways of evaluating what investigators had previously believed. Pierce created a public presence for the cases. Information could come from people who had been silent for years. Someone who had been afraid in 1987 might be willing to speak decades later. Someone who had dismissed a memory might suddenly understand its importance. Someone who had heard a name in a bar, on a street, or inside a prison might finally decide to tell investigators. Time can destroy evidence. But sometimes time also changes people. People talk. Secrets surface. Old loyalties disappear. And memories that were once buried can return. That was the hope. The murders had remained silent for decades. But the investigation was no longer willing to accept silence as the final answer. Rhonda's case was still officially unresolved. That fact mattered. It meant investigators could not simply announce a killer because a theory appeared convincing. They needed evidence. They needed corroboration. They needed something strong enough to survive scrutiny. And that standard was especially important after so many years. The public might want a dramatic conclusion. A headline might demand a shocking revelation. But a real cold case does not end because a story sounds convincing. It ends when evidence establishes what happened. For Rhonda, that evidence had not yet produced a final answer. Her name remained in the cold case files. Her murder remained unresolved. And the person responsible remained unidentified in the official record. But investigators were no longer standing exactly where they had stood in 1987. They had new information. They had new investigative techniques. And they had a suspect whose name had surfaced again. The possibility was unsettling. Because sometimes the most disturbing suspects are not strangers who suddenly appear in a case. Sometimes they are names that were already somewhere in the background. Names that had been mentioned. Names that had been considered. Names that had once seemed irrelevant. Then something changes. A new witness. A new piece of evidence. A new connection. And suddenly the old name looks different. That was happening in Warwick. The past was beginning to move. The cases of Kathy Perry and Rhonda Travers were no longer simply stories from the 1980s. They were active questions again. And behind those questions were two women. Kathy. Rhonda. Two lives cut short. Two families left waiting. Two murders that had refused to disappear. The city had changed since 1987. The roads had changed. Buildings had changed. People had grown older. Some had died. Some had moved away. But the evidence that survived could still matter. And that was the reason detectives kept looking. Not because they could promise a dramatic ending. Not because they could guarantee a conviction. But because the cases were not finished. Rhonda Travers had been murdered. Someone had done it. Someone knew something. And somewhere between Providence and Warwick, between the last moments of Rhonda's life and the discovery of her body on Kilvert Street, there was a sequence of events that investigators still needed to reconstruct. For decades, that sequence had remained hidden. Then a new generation of investigators began pulling at old threads. A name resurfaced. A forgotten lead gained importance. And the silence surrounding Warwick's cold cases began to crack. But Rhonda's killer had not yet been officially identified. The case remained open. The questions remained. And for the family of a woman whose life ended in 1987, the hardest part was still the same.
They knew how the story ended. They knew Rhonda was dead.
What they did not know was who was responsible. And after all those years, that unanswered question was still waiting inside the case file. The name inside the file was only a name. No confession. No courtroom testimony. No final forensic match. Just a possibility that had survived long enough to return. For investigators reopening the Warwick cases, that distinction mattered. They were not trying to manufacture an ending. They were trying to find one. Rhonda Lee Travers had been dead for decades. The city had moved on. The roads had changed. People who remembered 1987 had grown older. Some witnesses were gone. Some memories had faded. But the unanswered question remained exactly where it had always been. Who killed Rhonda? The investigation had begun with the discovery of her body on Kilvert Street. By then, whatever had happened to her had already happened. The killer had left. The scene could only tell investigators what remained. There were no cameras documenting the final moments. No modern phone records. No digital trail following a vehicle through Warwick. No electronic timeline showing where Rhonda had been minute by minute. Detectives had to work with the evidence available in 1987.
They had to talk to people.
They had to reconstruct movements. They had to examine physical evidence. They had to determine who Rhonda had been with before she disappeared. And they had to understand the circumstances of her life without allowing those circumstances to become an excuse for overlooking the crime. Rhonda's struggles with drugs and prostitution became part of the investigative record. But those facts did not explain her death. They did not identify her killer. They did not make the murder less serious. They were simply pieces of her life. That distinction matters when looking back at older homicide investigations. Victims whose lives were complicated can sometimes receive less attention. Their disappearances may not generate the same immediate public reaction. Their associations may be treated as explanations instead of clues. And when that happens, an investigation can lose something essential. The victim disappears twice. First physically, then from the attention of the people responsible for finding the truth. Rhonda's case would not disappear completely, but the investigation eventually slowed. The initial urgency faded. The file became older. And as the years passed, the case entered the category that investigators know all too well: cold. The word sounds final. It is not. A cold case can still contain evidence. It can still contain witnesses. It can still contain contradictions. And it can still contain a killer who has never been held accountable. The problem is that time changes everything around the evidence. People forget. Documents disappear. Buildings are demolished. Relationships change. Witnesses become reluctant. Some witnesses die. And investigators who worked the original case may no longer be available to explain why certain decisions were made. That creates another mystery inside the original mystery. Not only does a detective have to ask what happened to the victim, the detective must ask what happened to the investigation. Why did one lead receive attention while another did not? Why was one suspect eliminated? Why was another considered? Was evidence overlooked? Was information misunderstood? Was a witness ignored? Was a connection never recognized? Those questions become essential when the case is reopened decades later. And Warwick had more than one homicide to reconsider. Kathy Perry had been murdered months before Rhonda. Her case had its own history, her own unanswered questions, her own family waiting. The similarities between the two cases made the possibility of a connection difficult to ignore. Both women were young. Both were murdered in Warwick. Both cases remained unresolved. That did not prove the same killer was responsible, but it created a question. Could the two cases be connected? For investigators, the answer could not be based on coincidence alone. They needed evidence. They needed a timeline. They needed to know whether the same person could realistically have been involved. And they needed to determine whether information from one case could help explain the other. That process took years. Meanwhile, the city continued to change. People drove past the places where the crimes had happened without knowing what had occurred there. Businesses changed. Homes changed. New residents arrived. Old residents left. A generation grew up knowing the cases only as stories. But for investigators, the old files were different. Every photograph represented a moment. Every statement represented a memory. Every piece of evidence represented a possibility. The cold case detective's job is often to separate what is known from what is assumed. That sounds simple. It is not. A case file can contain hundreds of pages. Some details are reliable. Others are incomplete. Some statements contradict each other. Some witnesses remember something differently years later. Some information was never verified. And some clues may have been dismissed because investigators were already convinced they knew who they were looking for. That is why reopening a case requires patience. You cannot simply take an old theory and repeat it. You have to question the theory itself. That was particularly important in Warwick. The original investigations had not produced convictions. Whatever investigators had believed in the 1980s had not been enough to establish who killed these women. The absence of a conviction meant the door remained open. And years later, detectives were prepared to walk through it again. The work was not glamorous. There was no dramatic soundtrack. No instant breakthrough. It was interviews, records, old reports, cross-checking, names, dates, locations. Again and again. The detective has to live inside the past. To understand the case, investigators have to reconstruct a world that no longer exists. What did Warwick look like in 1986? What did it look like in 1987? Where did people work? Where did they socialize? How did they travel? Who knew whom? Which relationships mattered? Which people had access to the victims? Which people had motive? Which people had opportunity? and which people had simply been overlooked? That final question can haunt a cold case. Someone may have been interviewed decades earlier. Their name may be sitting in a report, but nobody knows whether that person was important. Until years later. Then the file is opened. The same name appears. A detective recognizes something. A connection emerges. A question is asked again. That was the significance of the informant's information concerning Stanley. The name had appeared before. Now it was appearing again. The information was not enough by itself, but it was enough to justify another look. That is how cold case investigations often move. Not with one enormous breakthrough, with small pieces. A name, a statement, a forgotten report, a contradiction, a forensic possibility, a person who finally decides to talk. Each piece can become more important when placed beside another. The investigator's task is to determine whether those pieces actually belong together. And with Stanley, Pierce began looking deeper. The man had already been convicted in another cold case. That history mattered. But it could not automatically make him responsible for Kathy's murder. One crime does not prove another. Investigators had to be careful. A suspect's past can provide context. It cannot substitute for evidence. That was one of the lessons embedded in the Warwick investigation. The detective could not simply say, he did something terrible before, therefore he did this. The question had to remain narrower. Could the evidence connect him to Kathy? Could the evidence connect him to Rhonda? Could the timeline work? Could witnesses confirm anything? Could physical evidence support the theory? Could the suspect's movements be reconstructed? These were the questions that mattered. And they were questions that could take months or years to answer. The old case had no patience. The families had already waited decades. But the investigators could not afford to rush. A false conclusion would not be justice. It would simply create another failure. That was especially important because the families had already experienced the worst kind of uncertainty. They had lost people they loved. They had no final explanation. They had no conviction to point toward. They had no courtroom moment when a judge could formally establish responsibility. They had only memories, photographs, and the knowledge that somewhere someone knew more than they had ever admitted. For Rhonda's family, that knowledge could be unbearable. A killer does not disappear simply because the investigation becomes cold. The killer continues living, eating, sleeping, driving, working, growing older. Meanwhile, the victim remains frozen at the moment of death. That is one of the cruelest realities of an unsolved homicide. Time moves for everyone except the person who was killed. Rhonda remained 20-something forever. The people who loved her aged. The investigators aged. The city aged. The world changed. But the murder remained. That is why cold case detectives often describe their work as giving victims a voice. The victim cannot speak. The evidence has to speak for them. And evidence does not always speak loudly. Sometimes it whispers. A name. A location. A vehicle. A statement. A forgotten connection. A piece of physical evidence preserved for decades. The challenge is hearing it. The investigation into Warwick's old murders was beginning to hear those whispers again. The case of Kathy Perry was receiving renewed attention. The possibility of a connection to Rhonda was still there. And the name Stanley had returned. But investigators still needed something stronger. They needed a path from suspicion to proof. That path could take them through old records. It could take them through people who had never been properly questioned. It could take them through relationships that had been forgotten. And it could take them back to the days immediately before Kathy and Rhonda disappeared. Every minute mattered. Every location mattered. Every person mattered. Because the killer had made mistakes. Every killer leaves something behind. Sometimes it is physical. Sometimes it is a witness. Sometimes it is a contradiction. Sometimes it is a memory. Sometimes it is simply a name that keeps returning. And in Warwick, one name had returned. The detectives knew better than to treat that as a verdict. But they also knew better than to ignore it. The cold case was moving again. Not solved. Not yet, but moving. And that alone was significant. For years, the files had waited. Now someone was reading them with fresh eyes. The question was no longer whether the murders belonged to the past. They clearly did. The question was whether the past still contained enough evidence to identify the person responsible. For Rhonda Travers, that question had waited since June 1987. For Kathy Perry, it had waited even longer. 2 women. 2 families. 2 cases. And 1 city carrying the memory of murders that had never received a final answer. The investigation was beginning to pull at those old threads. And somewhere within those threads was the possibility of finally discovering what had happened. Not a story. Not a theory. Not a headline. Evidence. Because after decades of uncertainty, that was the only thing that could finally close the distance between a murder and justice. The first mistake in a cold case is assuming that the old file contains the whole story. Sometimes it does. Sometimes it contains only the version investigators were able to build at the time. In Warwick, Rhode Island, the murder of Rhonda Lee Travers had been reduced to a handful of facts repeated for decades. June 20th, 1987. Kilvert Street. A body discovered in a wooded area near the Leviton manufacturing dump. A woman from Providence. A homicide with no identified killer. But when investigators returned to the case years later, those facts were no longer enough. They wanted to know what had happened before Rhonda reached Kilvert Street. That question pushed them backward. Back toward Providence. Back toward the people who had known Rhonda. Back toward the places where she had been seen. And back toward a period in Warwick when another young woman had been murdered. Kathy Perry. Her murder had happened 9 months earlier. September 1986. Kathy was 20 years old. She was working at Ultra Finishers in Warwick. She attended cosmetology school during the day. Her future was beginning to take shape. On the evening of September 14th, she drove to work in her 1979 Mercury Capri. She crossed paths with her mother on the road. They waved. It was an ordinary moment. The kind of moment nobody remembers until something terrible happens afterward. Kathy worked until approximately 2:15 the following morning. After her shift, she stopped at a gas station. She spoke with a former high school acquaintance who worked there. Kathy said she was tired. She had class the next morning. She was alone. Nothing appeared wrong. Then she left. She drove toward home. She never arrived. Around 2 hours later, police received a call about an abandoned vehicle on Route 2 South. Kathy's Mercury Capri was there. A witness reported seeing a man with long hair drinking from a beer can. A large older green vehicle was parked nearby. Kathy's car was behind it. That witness became important. Police needed to know who the man was. They needed to know why Kathy's vehicle was abandoned. They needed to know whether he had seen her. And they needed to know whether the green car belonged to someone connected to her disappearance. But the investigation did not immediately produce a killer. Kathy's body was eventually found behind Arlington Trailer Sales on Quaker Lane. The location was secluded. Her car had been abandoned roughly 1.5 miles away. The distance was small on a map. But for investigators, it represented a critical gap. What had happened between the road and the place where Kathy was found? Who had been with her? How had she been taken there?
And why?
The witness who saw the man and the green car became part of the investigation. At one point, investigators used hypnosis in an attempt to help him remember additional details. It was a technique used by police during that era. But memory is complicated. A witness can remember an image without remembering a face. A vehicle can be remembered without a license plate. A sound can remain while the sequence of events disappears. And every uncertainty creates another question. The investigation continued. But the answers did not come. Then the case became connected, at least in the minds of investigators, to a larger concern. Women were being murdered in and around Warwick. Rhonda's death followed months later. And suddenly, the possibility of a pattern was impossible to ignore. But there was a dangerous problem. A pattern can help investigators. It can also create assumptions. If two cases look similar, detectives naturally ask whether one person could be responsible. That is reasonable. But similarity is not proof. The investigation had to establish the connection. That would become especially important decades later. Because when Fred Pierce reopened the cases, he did not simply ask whether Kathy and Rhonda had been killed by the same person. He began asking a different question. Could both murders be connected to someone investigators had never properly considered? That question changed the direction of the investigation. Pierce had spent decades in law enforcement. He had joined Warwick Police after earlier service with the Rhode Island National Guard. He eventually became a detective sergeant. For 22 years, he supervised the night shift as detective sergeant. Then, in 2004, he was designated Warwick's cold case sergeant. At the time, Warwick had roughly 15 unsolved homicides dating back to the 1970s. Many were connected to organized crime. But Kathy Perry's murder was different. It was personal. It was violent. And it had never been solved. Pierce began working the case. He reviewed the old reports. He examined the evidence. He revisited the timeline. He looked at the photographs. He tried to understand what the original investigators had known. But there was still a barrier. The passage of time. A cold case does not simply sit untouched. It decays. People forget. Records become harder to locate. Witnesses disappear. And some evidence cannot be recreated. Yet Pierce kept going. The investigation eventually gained something that had been missing for years. Public attention. A Facebook page was created for Kathy's case. The purpose was simple. Put Kathy's name back into the public conversation. Remind people that the case remained unsolved. Give anyone with information a way to speak. That decision mattered. Because decades after a murder, the person who knows something may not be the person police originally interviewed. It could be someone who was a child at the time. Someone who heard a story from a relative. Someone who saw a vehicle. Someone who knew a suspect. Someone who remained silent because they were afraid. Time changes those calculations. And eventually someone did speak. The call came from Robert Bob Catlow, Chief Inspector of the Rhode Island Department of Corrections. Catlow had seen Pierce's Facebook page. He knew a long-time informant inside the adult correctional institutions. And according to Catlow, that informant knew who had killed Kathy Perry. That sentence changed the investigation. Because information from an informant is not proof. It is a lead. A lead must be tested. But the name attached to the information immediately caught Pierce's attention. Stanley. That was the pseudonym used for the suspect. It was not his real name. Pierce had requested that the real name not be publicly used. The reason was simple. An accusation is not a conviction. A suspect's identity should not become public merely because someone claims responsibility. But the name itself was not completely new to Pierce. He had heard it before. Years earlier, after local reporting about the reopening of Kathy's case, a West Warwick detective had contacted him. The detective had suggested Stanley deserved attention.
Why?
Because Stanley had previously been convicted of manslaughter in another cold case involving Cheryl Johnson. Pierce investigated the possibility. But at the time, he was not convinced Stanley was responsible for Kathy's murder. The lead did not develop. Then the informant called, and the same name returned. This time, Pierce reacted differently. He later reflected on how much time he might have lost by not paying closer attention when Stanley had first been mentioned. That realization became part of the investigation's turning point. Because now Pierce had two separate reasons to examine the same man. One had come from another detective. The second came from a long-time correctional informant. Neither was enough to establish guilt. But together, they justified another look.
Pierce went deeper.
He examined Stanley's background, his movements,
his history,
his connections. And he began asking whether the man's life intersected with the circumstances surrounding Kathy and Rhonda. This was where the investigation began to change. The cases no longer existed only as two separate files. They became part of a larger network. Not because investigators assumed the murders were connected, because they began looking for the person who could connect them. Pierce described the breakthrough as overcoming what he called linkage blindness. The important question was not simply whether Kathy and Rhonda were linked to each other. It was whether both women could be linked to their assailant. That distinction was enormous. For decades, investigators had naturally compared the victims. Both women. Both murders. Both locations. But the Rayall breakthrough required investigators to turn the comparison around. Look at the suspect. Look at his life. Look at where he was. Look at who he knew. Look at whether his history intersected with both victims. That is how a cold case begins to move. The investigator stops asking only, what do these crimes have in common? The investigator starts asking, who appears at the center of these facts? For Rhonda, that question was particularly important. Her body had been found on Kilvert Street. She had last been seen in Providence. She had been living a life that exposed her to people and circumstances investigators had to reconstruct carefully. Her belongings were later found in another part of Warwick. Reports also described her body as having been dragged from a vehicle to the location where she was found. There did not appear to have been a struggle at the discovery site. No weapon was found there. Those details did not solve the murder. But they suggested something important. The place where Rhonda was found may not have been the place where she was killed. The killer may have brought her there. That meant investigators had to think about transportation. Vehicles. Routes. People who could move through Warwick without attracting attention. And suddenly, old questions surrounding Kathy's abandoned car became relevant in a different way. Kathy's vehicle. The green car. The witness. The secluded locations. The movements through Warwick. None of these details proved that one man killed both women. But together, they created a framework investigators could test. And testing was exactly what mattered. The cold case could not be solved by intuition. It could not be solved by a dramatic story. It needed corroboration. That was the difference between the old investigation and the new one. The old investigation had been trapped by the limitations of its time. The new investigation had decades of hindsight. It could examine information that had once seemed unrelated. It could compare records. It could use modern investigative methods. And it could ask people questions again. But one question remained. If Stanley had been involved, why had nobody connected him to the murders decades earlier? That question did not weaken the theory. It made the investigation more important. Because sometimes a suspect remains hidden not because investigators ignored every clue. Sometimes the clues existed separately. One detective had one piece. Another detective had another. A witness remembered a vehicle. An informant knew a name. A previous conviction created a background. A cold case investigator eventually placed the pieces beside each other. Only then did a possible pattern emerge. That was happening in Warwick. The investigation was no longer frozen, but it was not solved. Not yet. The name Stanley was still only a lead. Rhonda's murder remained officially unsolved. Kathy's murder remained unresolved. And the investigators still had to establish what could be proved. The families had already waited decades. They did not need another theory. They needed the truth. And that meant the detectives had to follow the evidence wherever it went, even if it led away from the story everyone had believed for years. Because in a cold case, the most dangerous words are not, "we don't know." They are, "we already know." Warwick's investigators were finally willing to admit that they did not know. And that admission opened the door. Behind it was an old name, a forgotten lead, a convicted killer from another case, an informant willing to talk, and two women whose murders had remained unanswered for far too long. The files were open again. And this time, detectives were not searching for the easiest explanation. They were searching for the one that could survive the evidence. The deeper Fred Pierce went into the old files, the less comfortable the investigation became. Because the case was not simply missing an answer. It was missing a reliable path to the answer. For years, investigators had worked with fragments, names, statements, vehicles, locations, rumors. and the unavoidable fact that two women had been murdered in Warwick within 9 months of each other. Kathy Perry disappeared after leaving work in the early morning hours of September 15, 1986. Rhonda Travers was found dead on June 20, 1987. Different women. Different circumstances. Different lives.
But the same city.
And the same terrible result. No one had been arrested for either murder. That fact remained. The files had never received the final line investigators wanted.
Solved.
Instead, they carried the word that every family dreads. Unsolved.
Pierce understood what that meant.
A cold case is not just an old investigation. It is an investigation that has failed to reach the person responsible. That distinction matters, because a case can be old and still active. A detective can retire. A witness can move. A suspect can disappear. But the murder does not disappear. The victim does not disappear. And the unanswered question does not disappear. Pierce had spent years working inside Warwick Police.
He knew the city.
He knew the department. He knew how investigations could change when years passed. By the time he became the department's cold case sergeant in 2004, Warwick had roughly 15 unsolved homicides dating back to the 1970s. Some were connected to organized crime. Others were different. Kathy's case was one of the cases that stayed with him. There was something particularly disturbing about it. She had been young. She had been working. She had plans. She had been heading home. And somewhere between the gas station and the place where her abandoned car was discovered, everything changed. Her mother had seen her that evening. They had waved to each other. There had been no warning.
No dramatic goodbye.
Just an ordinary moment that made the disappearance harder to understand. A normal night had turned into a murder investigation. And then there was the abandoned Mercury Capri. The car was found on Route 2 South. The location was only a few miles from Kathy's home. It was also along the route she would have taken. The car was there. Kathy was not. That meant the investigation had to reconstruct what happened at the roadside. Did she stop voluntarily? Was she forced to stop? Did someone approach her? Was another vehicle involved? A witness reported seeing a man near the car. He was described as having long hair and drinking from a beer can. An older green vehicle was nearby. Those details became part of the case. But a description from decades ago is not the same as an identification. The witness could provide information, but investigators still needed to determine who that person was, whether the person was connected to Kathy, and whether the vehicle mattered. The investigation continued without a definitive answer. Then Kathy's body was discovered behind Arlington Trailer Sales on Quaker Lane. The distance between the abandoned vehicle and the body created another question. Why there? Why had she been taken away from the road? Who knew the area? Who had access to a vehicle? Who could move through Warwick during the early morning hours without drawing attention? Those questions were not simple. They were pieces of a timeline that had to be rebuilt from almost nothing. And while investigators were still struggling with Kathy's murder, another woman would die.
Rhonda Travers.
9 months later, her body was found on Kilvert Street. The case entered the same city, the same era, the same atmosphere of fear. Investigators could not ignore the possibility that the murders were connected. But suspicion was not proof. That became increasingly important as the years passed. A connection between two murders can be tempting. It can give investigators a theory. But a theory can become dangerous if detectives begin forcing evidence to fit it. The task was not to make the cases connected. The task was to determine whether they actually were. That distinction would become central to Pierce's work. He had to approach the cases with the possibility that they were connected, but also with the possibility that they were not. And that meant following the evidence. The original investigation had already produced a long list of people. As Pierce explained, names always come up in homicide cases. People are considered. They are checked. They are ruled out. Sometimes they have alibis. Sometimes evidence points elsewhere. Sometimes investigators simply cannot establish a connection. That process is normal. What matters is what happens when a name comes back years later. Stanley came back. The first time Pierce heard the name was after a West Warwick detective contacted him following an article about Kathy's case. The detective believed Stanley deserved attention. There was a reason. Stanley had previously been convicted of manslaughter in another cold case involving Cheryl Johnson. Pierce looked into him. But he did not believe the evidence connected Stanley to Kathy. So the investigation did not move forward. That decision would stay in Pierce's mind. Because years later, another source independently brought Stanley's name to him. This time, it came through the Rhode Island Department of Corrections. Chief Inspector Robert Bob Catlow contacted Pierce. He said a longtime informant at the adult correctional institutions wanted to provide information. The informant claimed to know who killed Kathy. Then came the name.
Stanley.
Pierce recognized it immediately. That moment mattered. Not because it proved anything. It did not. But because the name had already existed inside the investigation. Now it was returning from another source. Two separate paths were pointing toward the same person. That demanded another look. Pierce did not have the luxury of simply accepting the accusation. He had to investigate the suspect. He had to learn everything he could. His background. His movements. His criminal history. His relationships. The people around him. And whether his history intersected with Kathy or Rhonda. The more Pierce examined Stanley's background, the more disturbing it became. According to the later investigation, Stanley's adult criminal history in Rhode Island went back at least to 1987. He had been arrested in Cranston on an assault charge involving a dangerous substance. He later pleaded no contest to simple assault and battery. During the 1990s, his criminal history expanded. There were convictions involving first-degree sexual assault, robbery, another first-degree sexual assault conviction, conspiracy to commit robbery, escape, and another violent incident involving a screwdriver. These facts were not proof that Stanley murdered Kathy or Rhonda. They were background. But they changed how investigators viewed the possibility that he might have been involved. His history established that serious violence was not outside his known behavior. Still, Pierce needed more. A criminal record can make a person look dangerous. It cannot establish responsibility for a specific murder. That line had to remain clear. The investigation needed to connect Stanley to the women, to the locations,
to the timeline,
to the circumstances. Without that connection, the theory would remain only a theory. That was the difficult part. The informant's story could point investigators toward someone, but investigators still had to prove what the person had done. And decades after a murder, proving that can be extraordinarily difficult. The investigator has to build a bridge across time. On one side is 1986. On the other side is the present. In between are decades of missing information. Pierce began looking for whatever could survive that distance. Old records. Old interviews. Old relationships. Old criminal cases. Old locations. Anything that could establish where Stanley had been, who he had known, and whether he had crossed paths with either victim. The investigation also had another complication. Stanley was already incarcerated. That meant investigators were not dealing with an unknown person moving freely through Warwick. They were dealing with someone already inside the correctional system. And according to later reporting, his criminal history had resulted in additional charges and sentences that kept him incarcerated. That fact would become significant. Because if investigators could establish that Stanley was responsible, his existing imprisonment would not erase the need for justice. A murder conviction would still matter. For the families, it would matter enormously. But investigators were not there yet. They had a suspect. They had an informant. They had a troubling criminal history. They had 2 unsolved murders. What they did not yet have was enough evidence for an indictment. That gap was everything. And it is exactly where many cold cases die again. A lead appears. The suspect looks plausible. The history seems disturbing. The theory feels convincing. But the evidence does not cross the final line. Pierce understood that danger. He had already seen what happened when investigators pursued a theory without enough proof. The goal was not to create a dramatic ending. The goal was to create a case that could survive. That meant corroboration. It meant checking the informant's information. It meant determining whether the information could be independently verified. It meant asking whether Stanley's history actually intersected with Kathy's disappearance. And then there was Rhonda. Why had her name continued to appear beside Kathy's? Could the same person have been involved? The possibility became more serious as Pierce examined the cases together. Both women had been found dead in Warwick. Both murders remained unsolved. And investigators had long suspected that Rhonda's homicide might be part of a series of unsolved killings from that period. But suspicion could not establish a serial connection. The cases had to be tested individually. That was the challenge. If Stanley was responsible for Kathy, that did not automatically mean he was responsible for Rhonda. Each victim required evidence. Each crime required proof. And each family deserved an investigation based on facts rather than convenience. That principle kept the investigation from becoming a simple story. There was no easy villain. No confirmed confession. No official declaration that everything was solved. There was only an increasingly compelling lead. And a detective who refused to let it disappear. Pierce continued digging. The old files were opened again. The timeline was reconstructed again. The names were examined again. And the cases began to feel less like forgotten murders and more like unfinished investigations. That was important. Because the greatest enemy of a cold case is not always the lack of evidence. Sometimes it is the belief that nothing more can be done. Pierce rejected that belief. He had already spent years on the case. Now he had a reason to keep going. The informant had provided a name Pierce had heard before. A name connected to another violent case. A name attached to a criminal history that became increasingly difficult to ignore. But a name was still just a name. The investigation needed something stronger. Something that could move the case from possibility to proof. And that search brought Pierce deeper into the history of Warwick's murders. The more he looked, the more one fact became impossible to escape. The old cases had never really gone away. They had simply been waiting. Waiting for a witness to speak. Waiting for an investigator to ask a different question. Waiting for evidence to be seen in a different context. And perhaps, waiting for someone to finally connect pieces that had been sitting apart for decades. Rhonda Travers was still waiting. Kathy Perry was still waiting. Their families were still waiting. And the investigators were now standing at the edge of something that could either become the breakthrough they had been searching for, or another dead end. The difference would come down to evidence. Nothing else. The case had reached a dangerous point. There was finally a name. There was finally a direction. But there was still no certainty. For decades, that had been the difference between a lead and a solution in Warwick. Investigators had names before. They had theories before. They had suspects before. What they had never had was enough evidence to close the case. Now Fred Pierce was determined not to repeat the same mistake. He had the name Stanley. He had information from a long-time prison informant. He had an earlier suggestion from another detective. And he had a criminal history that demanded attention. But none of those things, individually or together, could simply transform suspicion into guilt. The murders of Kathy Perry and Rhonda Travers required something more. They required a connection. The question was no longer merely whether Stanley was a dangerous man. The question was whether he had crossed paths with Kathy. Whether he had crossed paths with Rhonda. Whether he had been in the right place at the right time. And whether evidence could establish what he had done. That meant returning to 1986. Kathy's final hours had to be reconstructed again. She had been at work. She had been preparing to leave. She had spoken to someone at a gas station. She had plans for the following morning. Then she disappeared. Her Mercury Capri was found abandoned. Her body was found later. Every one of those facts was important. But the most important question was still the gap between them. What happened after Kathy left the gas station? That gap had haunted investigators for decades. A young woman leaving work in the early morning. A vehicle later found abandoned. A body discovered away from the vehicle. a witness who remembered a man and a green vehicle, and no final explanation. The investigation had to move through those gaps carefully. A witness remembered seeing a man with long hair drinking from a beer can. An older green vehicle was nearby. Was the man connected to Kathy? Was he simply a passerby? Was the vehicle involved? Was it unrelated? At the time, investigators did not have enough to answer those questions. The years did not make the answers easier, but they made them more important. Because when a case is reopened, investigators are not looking for the perfect memory. They are looking for consistency. A detail repeated independently can become important. A location that appears in multiple accounts can become important. A name that surfaces from different sources can become important. And sometimes a suspect who was once dismissed can return to the center of the investigation. That was what had happened with Stanley. The first mention had not produced a breakthrough. The second mention changed things. The informant had not simply offered a random name. The informant claimed to know who had killed Kathy. That was a serious allegation. Pierce had to determine what the informant knew, how the informant knew it, whether the information could be independently confirmed, and whether there were details that only someone close to the crime could have known. Those questions became critical. An informant can be wrong. An informant can lie. An informant can repeat rumors. An informant can have personal motives. But an informant can also provide information that investigators cannot obtain anywhere else. The detective's job is to determine which one is happening. Pierce did not have the luxury of guessing. He had to investigate. That investigation led him deeper into Stanley's background. And the background was extensive. By 1987, Stanley had already encountered the Rhode Island criminal justice system. He had been arrested in Cranston in connection with an assault involving a dangerous substance. He later pleaded no contest to simple assault and battery. The following year, he was convicted of breaking and entering. Then came the 1990s. A first-degree sexual assault conviction. A robbery conviction. Another first-degree sexual assault conviction. A conspiracy conviction. Escape. Another violent incident. The record painted a picture of repeated criminal behavior. But again, Pierce had to resist the temptation to make the record do more than it could. A violent history is not proof of a particular murder. That distinction is essential. If investigators allowed a criminal record to become the evidence, they would be repeating the same fundamental mistake that had damaged other investigations. The case needed facts, not impressions, not assumptions. Facts. And facts had to be connected to the murders. That meant looking at the locations. Warwick, Providence, the roads, the workplaces, the places where people met, the areas where the victims were last seen, the areas where their bodies were found, the movements of potential suspects. Every location became a question. Could Stanley have been there? Was he living nearby? Did he work nearby? Did he know anyone connected to the victims? Was there a vehicle connection? Did someone remember seeing him? The answers did not arrive quickly. Cold cases rarely cooperate. They resist. They force investigators to work through layers of uncertainty. One report leads to another. One name leads to another. A detective discovers that a witness mentioned someone decades earlier. Then another report suggests something different. The investigator must decide which information deserves attention. And sometimes the most important clue is hidden inside something that originally seemed insignificant. That possibility was particularly important in Kathy's case. The old reports contained information about her car, the witness, the green vehicle, the location. Those details had been recorded decades earlier. But a report can be read differently when the investigator knows what questions to ask. Pierce could now compare those details with information about Stanley. He could examine whether his movements were consistent with what investigators knew. He could determine whether there was a plausible connection. He could search for people who had known him at the time. And he could revisit the broader question. Was Kathy targeted? Was the attack random? Did the killer know her? Or did the killer encounter her by chance? Each possibility required a different investigation. If the killer knew Kathy, Investigators needed to examine relationships. If the killer did not know her, they needed to examine opportunity. If a vehicle was involved, they needed to understand transportation. If the body had been moved, they needed to understand where and why. These questions were not dramatic. They were methodical. But cold cases are solved through method, not through dramatic guesses, not through sensational headlines, not through the most frightening possibility. Evidence. That word remained at the center of Pierce's work. Evidence. The cases had been open for decades because evidence had never established responsibility. Now the investigation had to find enough evidence to change that. And the possibility of a connection between Kathy and Stanley created another problem. If Stanley was responsible for Kathy, could he also be responsible for Rhonda? The answer could not be assumed. Rhonda's murder had its own circumstances. She had been last seen in Providence. Her body had been discovered on Kilvert Street in Warwick. Her belongings were later found in another location. The reports indicated that her body had been dragged from a vehicle. There was no obvious struggle at the place where she was found. That detail mattered. It suggested that the location could have been a disposal site rather than the primary crime scene. The killer may have brought her there after the murder. That meant investigators had to think about transportation again. A vehicle. A route. A person capable of moving through Warwick. The same questions that surrounded Kathy's case began to appear again. But similarity still did not equal proof. It simply meant the possibility deserved investigation. And that investigation had to be done carefully. Because there was another danger. If detectives became convinced that one person was responsible for both murders, they might begin interpreting every fact through that assumption. That was precisely what they were trying to avoid. The goal was not to make the cases fit. The goal was to determine whether they fit. That distinction could determine whether the investigation finally succeeded or failed again.
Pierce understood that.
He also understood the pressure. The cases were old. The families had waited. The public wanted answers. Every new development attracted attention. But an arrest without evidence would only create another controversy. The investigation needed to move slowly enough to be accurate. That meant going back to people. Some witnesses had been silent for decades. Some had forgotten details. Others had never been asked the right question. A detective reopening a 1980s murder may have to explain why they are calling someone 30 years later. The answer is simple. Because something changed. A new lead. A new piece of information. A new connection. That was what brought investigators back to Stanley. And once they began looking, the old criminal history became impossible to ignore. But it was still not enough. The investigators needed to know whether Stanley had any connection to the specific crimes. That became the central problem. The cold case was no longer a search through the entire population of Rhode Island. It had narrowed. But it had not narrowed enough. One man was now receiving attention. 2 murders remained open. And investigators had to determine whether the 3 belonged together. The work continued. Meanwhile, the families remained at the center of the story. For decades, they had lived without certainty. A murder can be committed in minutes. The consequences can last generations. Kathy's family had been waiting since 1986. Rhonda's family had been waiting since 1987. The years did not reduce the significance of the murders. They only made the waiting longer. Every birthday, every holiday, every anniversary. Another reminder. Another year without an answer. For the families, the case could never become truly cold. The word belonged to the police file, not to them. And this is where the difference between a homicide investigation and a human life becomes impossible to ignore. Investigators see evidence. Families see a person. They remember a laugh, a voice, a face, a habit, a future that never happened. The detective has to reconstruct the crime. The family has to reconstruct the life. Both are searching for truth, but they experience the search differently. Pierce knew that. He understood that solving the case was not simply about closing a file. It was about answering questions that had remained open for decades. Who killed Kathy? Who killed Rhonda? Were the murders connected? And if they were, why had nobody seen the connection earlier? Those questions became more urgent as the investigation progressed. The name Stanley remained at the center, but investigators still needed to establish what the informant actually knew. The informant's credibility mattered. The details mattered. The source mattered. And the investigators had to determine whether any information could be independently verified. That is the slow part of cold case work, the part that rarely makes headlines. Detectives sit with reports. They compare dates. They search databases. They examine old files. They call people. They wait. They call again. They ask the same question differently. They test the answer. They look for contradictions. They look for confirmation. And sometimes they discover that a detail everyone thought was important was meaningless. Sometimes they discover the opposite. A detail everyone ignored becomes central. That possibility kept Pierce working. Because somewhere in the old investigation was something that had been missed. Maybe it was a witness. Maybe it was a relationship. Maybe it was a movement. Maybe it was a name. Maybe it was a combination of several small details. The challenge was finding it, and then proving it. By this point, the case had become more than a search for a suspect. It had become a reconstruction of Warwick in the 1980s. Investigators were rebuilding the world in which Kathy and Rhonda had lived.
Who was around them?
Who moved through the city? Who knew the victims? Who had access to vehicles? Who had a reason to approach them? Who had the opportunity? And who had disappeared from the investigation because nobody had asked the right question? The answers were still incomplete. But the investigation had changed. The cases were no longer sitting untouched. A detective was pulling them apart, looking at them again, challenging old conclusions, and refusing to accept that decades were enough to make the murders unsolvable. That was the real significance of the renewed investigation. Not that a killer had already been identified, not that a conviction was guaranteed, but that the cases were alive again. The name of Stanley had reopened a door. Behind that door were old crimes, old witnesses, old records, and old memories. Some of those memories would lead nowhere. Others might change everything. And somewhere inside that uncertainty was the answer the families had been waiting for. For Kathy. For Rhonda. For the people who had spent decades asking the same impossible question. Who did this? The investigation had not reached the final answer. But for the first time in years, the detectives were moving toward it. And every step forward meant one thing. The silence was becoming harder to maintain. The silence surrounding the Warwick murders had lasted so long that even a new lead could feel like a threat. Not a threat to the investigators. A threat to the version of the past that everyone had grown accustomed to. For decades, the murders of Kathy Perry and Rhonda Lee Travers had existed as unfinished stories. The victims were known. The locations were known. The approximate timelines were known. But the person responsible remained outside the final frame. That was what Fred Pierce was trying to change. He was not trying to rewrite 1986. He was trying to understand it. And that meant returning to the details that had survived. Kathy's final night remained one of the most important. She had worked at Ultra Finishers in Warwick. She had plans for the following morning. She had spoken with a former high school acquaintance at a gas station after leaving work. She was tired. Then she drove away. Those ordinary details became extraordinary only because she never made it home. Her mother had seen her earlier. They had waved. Neither knew it would be one of the last moments they would ever share. That kind of detail can haunt a family for decades. Not because anything unusual happened. Because nothing unusual happened. There was no warning. No final argument.
No dramatic Goodyear.
Just a daughter on the road. Then an empty car. Then a body. The investigation had to bridge those moments. And every year that passed made the bridge harder to build. The witness who saw the man near Kathy's abandoned vehicle remained one of the few known windows into the early morning. He had seen a man with long hair. He had seen a beer can. He had seen an older green vehicle. But a description is not an identification. The mind can preserve an image while losing certainty about details. And decades later, even a sincere witness can struggle to separate memory from everything that happened afterward. Investigators knew that. So they could not simply take an old description and force it onto a suspect. They needed corroboration. They needed something that would place a person at the right location, at the right time, with the right connection. That was the standard.
And it was not easy to meet.
The original investigators had worked without the technology available to modern detectives.
No smartphones.
No widespread surveillance network. No digital location history. No instant database searches connecting every person and every address. Much of the investigation depended on interviews and physical evidence. A detective could knock on a door, ask a question,
write down the answer,
then move to the next person. If someone lied, the lie might survive. If someone forgot, the missing memory might never be recovered. If a witness never came forward, investigators might never know the witness existed. That was the reality of 1986. And it became the reality of 1987. When Rhonda Travers was found dead on June 20th, the investigation entered another difficult phase. Now detectives had another homicide, another victim, another family, another unanswered question. Rhonda's life had been complicated. Her history included drug use and prostitution. Those details appeared in the reporting surrounding her case. But investigators reopening the murder had to look beyond them, because a victim's circumstances do not explain who killed her. They only describe part of the world she lived in. Rhonda had been last seen in Providence. Her body was discovered on Kilvert Street in Warwick. Her belongings were later found elsewhere. Investigators determined that her body appeared to have been dragged from a vehicle to the location. That raised a crucial possibility. The place where Rhonda was found may not have been the place where she died. That meant the killer may have used a vehicle. And if a vehicle had been involved, the investigation needed to determine whose. But decades had passed.
Cars had disappeared.
Owners had moved. Records had become harder to interpret. People who might have remembered a vehicle might no longer remember its color, model, or location. Again, time had become the enemy. Yet time had also created something else. Distance. And distance can change people's willingness to talk. A person who feared consequences in 1987 may not feel the same fear decades later. Someone who protected a friend may have fallen out with that friend. Someone who knew a secret may have decided that silence was no longer worth maintaining. That is why cold case detectives keep calling. Because people change. The truth sometimes changes hands. And eventually, information can emerge from unexpected places. In Warwick, it came from inside the correctional system. Robert Bob Catlow, chief inspector of the Rhode Island Department of Corrections, knew about Pierce's efforts. Catlow told him that a longtime informant at the adult correctional institutions claimed to know who had killed Kathy Perry. The name was Stanley. Again, that name was not presented publicly as a conviction. It was a claim. Something that required investigation. But Pierce had already heard the name. That was the part that made it difficult to dismiss. A West Warwick detective had previously mentioned Stanley after seeing renewed attention around Kathy's case. The detective believed Stanley deserved scrutiny. Stanley had previously been convicted of manslaughter in another cold case. Pierce had examined the possibility before. He had not been convinced. The connection to Kathy had not been established. The lead went nowhere. Then the informant independently returned the same name. Now Pierce had a reason to look again. This is where a cold case can change. Not because the evidence suddenly becomes conclusive. Because the investigator's question becomes sharper. The first time the question had been, could Stanley be connected to Kathy? The second time it became, why has Stanley's name appeared from more than one direction? That question was worth investigating. Pierce went deeper into Stanley's history. The criminal record was extensive. There were arrests and convictions beginning in the late 1980s. There were later convictions for serious violent crimes. The history was disturbing. But Pierce still had to separate background from evidence. That distinction is crucial. A detective cannot solve a murder by adding up a suspect's previous crimes. The question is always specific. What evidence connects this person to this victim? What evidence connects this person to this crime? What evidence connects this person to this location? That is the difference between suspicion and proof.
Pierce understood that.
So he kept digging. The investigation began to examine whether Stanley's life intersected with the lives of the victims.
People.
Places. Relationships. Movements. The goal was to find something that could be independently verified. The informant's statement was a starting point, not an ending. And that meant checking everything. Who was the informant? What access did the informant have? How could the informant have known? What exactly had been said? Were there details that could have been known only by someone with inside information? Could those details be confirmed through records or other witnesses? These questions were critical. A false informant could waste months. A truthful informant could unlock decades of silence. Investigators had to determine which one they were dealing with. Meanwhile, another issue emerged. Kathy's case had never been isolated from the larger story of Warwick. The murder had happened in a city that would soon see another young woman killed. That made the comparison unavoidable. Could one offender have been responsible for both? The question had to be approached carefully. Kathy's death did not prove anything about Rhonda. Rhonda's death did not prove anything about Kathy. But if the same suspect appeared in both investigations, the potential connection became more significant. That was what made the name Stanley so important. Not because it solved either murder, because it potentially gave investigators a person around whom the two cases could be tested. Could he have known Kathy? Could he have encountered Rhonda? Was he in Warwick? Was he in Providence? Did he have access to a vehicle? Did anyone remember him around the relevant times? Were there old records that could place him somewhere? Every question was another attempt to build a bridge across decades. The bridge had to be strong, because if prosecutors ever brought a case, every piece would be challenged. A defense attorney could question an informant. They could question an old witness. They could question a decades-old memory. They could challenge the interpretation of records. They could challenge the reliability of physical evidence. That meant detectives had to think beyond the arrest. They had to think about trial. Could the evidence survive? Could it convince a jury? Could it establish guilt beyond a reasonable doubt? Those questions forced investigators to be disciplined. They could not settle for probably. They needed proved. And that was where the investigation became painstaking. Old files were read again. Old information was compared. The detective looked for inconsistencies. He looked for information that had never been followed. He looked for names that appeared in one case but not another. He looked for connections between people. And he kept the possibility of linkage alive. The phrase linkage blindness would become important to Pierce's thinking. Investigators sometimes focus on similarities between victims. 2 women. 2 murders. 2 locations. But the more useful connection can sometimes be the offender, who moves between the cases, who appears around both, who has access, who has opportunity, who has a history that makes the theory plausible. That shift in perspective could change an investigation. Instead of asking why the victims were similar, ask what the perpetrator had in common with them. That was the direction Pierce was taking. And it forced him to confront an uncomfortable possibility. Maybe the killer had been visible all along. Maybe the investigation had simply been looking in the wrong direction. Maybe a person had been mentioned decades earlier and dismissed. Maybe the evidence had never been connected. Maybe the key was not new evidence at all. Maybe it was old evidence finally understood. That is one of the most frustrating realities of cold cases. The breakthrough is sometimes not a new clue. It is a new interpretation of an old clue. The old witness. The old vehicle. The old location. The old name. The same facts. Different eyes. That possibility kept Pierce working. And while he worked, the families continued to wait. For Kathy's family, the memory of that September night never ended. For Rhonda's family, June 1987 never became ordinary history. The rest of the world could forget. They could not. The anniversary of a murder does not feel like history to a family. It feels like a wound reopening. Every unanswered question returns. Who did it?
Why?
Was the killer ever questioned? Did investigators come close? Did someone know? Did someone stay silent? Those questions have no expiration date. That is why solving a cold case matters even decades later. Not because the past can be changed. It cannot. But because the truth can still be established. The dead cannot be brought back. But their families can receive an answer. A courtroom can establish responsibility. A conviction can create accountability. And an investigation can finally stop being a question. That was the goal. But the case was not there yet. The name Stanley had returned. The informant had spoken. The detective was listening. The old files were being reopened. Yet the decisive evidence was still missing. The investigation remained a race against time. Not because the killer was necessarily still free, but because witnesses were aging, records were disappearing, and memories were becoming harder to recover. Every day mattered. Every interview mattered. Every old report mattered. And somewhere inside those decades of silence was a detail that investigators believed could finally connect the pieces. The question was whether that detail would survive scrutiny. Because the difference between an unsolved murder and a solved murder can be incredibly small. One witness. One record. One contradiction. One overlooked connection. One piece of evidence that refuses to disappear. For Warwick, that search continued. And for Rhonda Travers, the question remained as painful as it had been since June 1987. Who took her life? For Kathy Perry, the question had remained unanswered since the early morning hours of September 15, 1986. Who did the same to her? 2 cases. 2 victims. 2 families. And a detective determined to discover whether the answers had been sitting inside the old files all along. The investigation was moving. But movement was not justice. The detectives needed proof. And until they found it, the word solved would remain out of reach. The problem with a 30-year-old murder is that every answer has to travel through time. A witness has to remember. A document has to survive. A location has to be identified. A suspect has to be placed somewhere. And every connection has to withstand the same question. How do you know? That question followed Fred Pierce through every stage of the investigation. He had a name. He had an informant. He had an old investigative lead. But he did not yet have the one thing a homicide investigator needs most: a chain of evidence. Without that chain, the case remained exactly what it had been for decades: unsolved. The murder of Kathy Perry had begun with an ordinary night. She worked. She left. She stopped at a gas station. She spoke with someone she knew. She said she was tired. Then she drove away. The next thing investigators knew for certain was that her car had been abandoned. That gap remained the center of the case. Everything depended on understanding what happened inside it. And the longer Pierce examined the old investigation, the more he understood how much uncertainty existed around those final hours. The witness who saw a man near Kathy's vehicle provided one piece. The green vehicle provided another. The location provided another. But none of them could independently establish who killed Kathy. That was the problem. Every clue seemed to stop just short of the answer. A face without an identification. A vehicle without a confirmed owner. A location without a reliable explanation. A witness without enough certainty. And a victim whose final movements remained incomplete. Pierce knew that cold cases are often built from these fragments. The detective's job is not to demand that one clue solve everything. The job is to determine whether the fragments can form a complete picture. That meant examining every available record. The original reports, old interviews, criminal histories, addresses, relationships, anything that could establish where people were during the relevant period. The investigation had become a reconstruction, not just of the crime, of the city. Warwick in the 1980s was not the Warwick of the 21st century. People moved differently. Communications were different. A person could disappear from someone's life without leaving a digital trail. There were no smartphones showing where someone had been. No automatic location history. No social media messages preserving conversations. No camera network recording every road. Investigators had to rely on people. And people are imperfect witnesses. Memory is not a recording. It changes. It fades. It combines events. A person may remember what they saw. Then, over the years, they may remember what they were told. That distinction becomes critical in a homicide investigation. Pierce had to separate the original memory from everything that happened afterward. The same problem existed with the informant. The informant claimed to know who killed Kathy. But how? That was the question. If the information came from a direct confession, investigators needed to know when it happened. If it came from another prisoner, they needed to know who that person was. If it came from a rumor, the information might be unreliable. If it came from someone with direct knowledge, the case could change dramatically. So Pierce had to investigate the informant itself. The source became evidence, not proof. Evidence. And the distinction mattered. An informant can provide a direction. Only corroboration can turn that direction into something stronger. That was why the name Stanley mattered. It had appeared twice. Once through a West Warwick detective. Again through the correctional system informant. Two separate sources. That was enough to make Pierce look harder. But not enough to accuse someone publicly. The suspect's real name remained protected in public discussions. Pierce understood the danger. A cold case can destroy a reputation if investigators get the wrong person. And after decades, the danger is even greater. People want closure. The media wants a headline. Families want answers. The public wants a suspect. But the justice system requires evidence. Pierce had to work inside that tension. The investigation could not move according to emotion. It had to move according to facts. That was particularly important because Stanley's history was disturbing. His criminal record contained serious offenses. But a record does not automatically explain an unrelated murder. Investigators had to resist the easiest conclusion. They had to ask whether his behavior, his movements, and his relationships actually intersected with the crimes. That meant looking at the timeline. 1986. Kathy disappears. 1987. Rhonda is murdered. Then later years. Stanley's criminal cases.
His arrests.
His convictions. His periods of incarceration. His movements. The dates mattered. If he was somewhere else, the theory weakened. If he could be placed near the crime, it strengthened. If a witness could independently confirm it, stronger still. If physical evidence supported it, the case could move into another category entirely. That was what Pierce was searching for. Something objective. Something that did not depend entirely on memory. Something that could survive a courtroom. But decades-old evidence does not always cooperate. Physical evidence can degrade. Testing methods change. Samples can become contaminated. Records can disappear. And some evidence simply does not exist. That meant investigators had to make the most of what remained. They also had to think differently. Modern cold case investigations often involve re-examining evidence using technology that did not exist when the crime occurred. A sample that could not be tested in the 1980s might be testable decades later. A fingerprint that was useless against old records might become valuable when databases expand. A photograph can be enhanced. A document can be digitized. A name can be cross-referenced across databases. But technology is not magic. It can only analyze what survives. And in Warwick, the investigators had to determine exactly what remained. The old evidence had to be cataloged. What existed? Where was it stored? Had it been preserved properly? Could it be tested? Had anything been lost? Were there biological samples? Were there fingerprints? Were there photographs? Were there trace materials? Were there objects that had never been fully examined? Each question mattered, because a cold case can be solved by something investigators already possessed. They simply may not have known its value. That possibility had enormous significance. Imagine an object collected in 1986. At the time, investigators may have had no technology capable of extracting useful information from it. 30 years later, the same object could potentially provide a clue. The object did not change. The science did. That is why Pierce and other cold case investigators could not simply read the old conclusions. They had to read the evidence itself. They had to ask what modern methods could reveal. That approach also applied to witness statements. A witness might have been considered unreliable decades earlier, but a modern investigator might discover that the witness had actually provided one detail that could be independently confirmed. A detail previously ignored. A street. A vehicle. A name. A relationship. That detail could change the importance of the entire statement. The investigation, therefore, became an exercise in reassessment, not rewriting. Reassessment. The old detectives had worked with what they knew. Pierce had the advantage of hindsight. He could see what happened afterward. He could compare later criminal cases with earlier unsolved murders. He could examine whether people who appeared harmless in 1986 later became violent offenders. He could ask whether an old suspect's later behavior changed the significance of earlier information. But again, that could only generate leads. It could not establish guilt. The question always returned. What connects Stanley to Kathy? And what connects Stanley to Rhonda? The second question was especially difficult. Rhonda's case had its own investigative history. She had been found on Kilvert Street. Her body appeared to have been moved. The scene itself did not provide an obvious explanation. Investigators had to determine where the murder happened. Who had access to that location? Who could have transported her? Why was she taken there? And who knew the area well enough to use it? Those questions had been asked before, but Pierce could now ask them alongside the information developing around Stanley. That was the significance of looking at the cases together. One investigation could provide context for another. A location in one case could matter in another. A witness in one file might know someone in the second. A suspect's history could intersect with both. The possibility of linkage was no longer just theoretical. It had become an investigative strategy. Pierce described the problem as linkage blindness. Investigators sometimes see two murders as separate because they occurred at different times. They look at the victims individually. They build separate timelines. They interview separate witnesses. But the offender may be the connecting point. The same person may appear in both stories. That was what Pierce needed to determine. Not whether Kathy and Rhonda were similar. Whether the person responsible for one crime could be connected to the other. That was a much harder question. And it required more than intuition. It required a timeline. A suspect. A victim. A location. A method. A connection. And evidence tying them together. The deeper Pierce went, the more the case began to resemble a puzzle with missing pieces. Some pieces were obvious. Others were damaged. Some belonged to the wrong picture. And some had disappeared completely. But the picture was still there. Kathy. Rhonda. Warwick. 1986. 1987. The old vehicles. The old roads. The old witnesses. The old names. The unanswered deaths. The question was whether enough pieces remained. That question was not only professional, it was personal for the families. Kathy's loved ones had spent decades knowing that someone had taken her life without being held accountable. Rhonda's family carried the same burden. There is a particular cruelty in an unsolved murder. The family knows what happened to their loved one, but they do not know who did it. They cannot direct their anger toward a person. They cannot hear an explanation. They cannot sit in court and hear evidence presented. They cannot watch a verdict being read. Instead, they live with uncertainty. And uncertainty can become its own form of punishment. That was why Pierce's work mattered. Even if the investigation did not produce an immediate arrest, reopening the case restored something that had been missing. Attention. Kathy's name was public again. Rhonda's murder was being discussed again. The cases were no longer invisible. People were reminded that these women had existed, that they had families, that they had futures, that their deaths were not simply old statistics. And once people began talking, information could surface. That was the hope. Maybe someone remembered a conversation. Maybe someone remembered a vehicle. Maybe someone remembered seeing Kathy. Maybe someone remembered seeing Rhonda. Maybe someone had heard a confession. Maybe someone had spent decades carrying information they were afraid to reveal. Every possibility mattered, because investigators did not know which one would lead somewhere. The hardest part was accepting that the answer might be buried inside a memory that had been silent for 30 years. A person could be living in another state. A witness could have changed their name. A former acquaintance could have died. A person who knew the suspect could have moved away. The investigation had to find them. That was why cold case work often feels endless. The detective is not simply investigating a crime. The detective is investigating time itself. Time hides things. Time destroys things. Time also exposes things. People age. Relationships change. Secrets become heavier. And sometimes the person who knows the truth finally decides to speak. That was exactly what had happened with the informant. The name had surfaced. Now Pierce had to determine what stood behind it. The next stage was not dramatic. It was methodical. Interview.
Verify. Compare. Search.
Reconstruct. Repeat. The detective had to determine whether the informant's story contained information that could only have come from someone close to the murder. That would be significant, because a person cannot easily invent a detail they could not have known. But even then, investigators would need corroboration. One reliable detail could lead to another. One verified fact could open another door. That is how cold cases move. Not with certainty. With probability. Then corroboration. Then evidence. Then, if everything holds together, accountability. Warwick had reached the probability stage. The name was there. The theory was there. The questions were there. But the final proof remained somewhere beyond reach. For Pierce, that meant the investigation could not stop. For the families, it meant another period of waiting. And for whoever knew what happened to Kathy and Rhonda, it meant the past was no longer as silent as it had been. Someone was asking questions again. Someone was reading the old files. Someone was comparing names. Someone was examining the forgotten details. And somewhere inside those details was the possibility that the truth had survived. The murders had waited decades. The investigation could wait no longer. The investigation had reached the point where every old fact carried a new question. That was the strange power of a cold case. Nothing had changed about the original murder. Kathy Perry was still dead. Rhonda Lee Travers was still dead. Their families were still waiting. But the investigators looking at the files had changed. The technology had changed. The records available to police had changed. And most importantly, the questions had changed. For Fred Pierce, that meant refusing to accept the original boundaries of the investigations. A case file can become a kind of prison. Once investigators decide what happened, every new fact gets compared against that conclusion. Facts that fit are remembered. Facts that do not fit can be ignored. That is how tunnel vision develops. Pierce wanted to avoid it. He needed to look at the cases as though he had never seen them before. Who was Kathy? Where had she been?
Who had seen her?
Where had her car been found? Where had her body been found? Who had access to both locations? Then the same questions had to be asked about Rhonda. Where had she been?
Who had seen her?
How had she reached Warwick?
Where was she found?
What happened between the last confirmed sighting and the discovery of her body? The more those questions were compared, the more important the physical locations became. A map could tell investigators something that a paragraph could not. Kathy's vehicle. The road. Quaker Lane. The location where her body was discovered. Rhonda's last known movements. Kilvert Street. The surrounding roads. The places where people could enter and leave without being noticed. Investigators had to think like the person who committed the crime. Not emotionally. Logistically. How could someone move through the area? How long would it take? What roads would make sense? Where could a vehicle stop? Where could someone dispose of a body? Which locations were isolated in the 1980s? Which locations were busy? Which locations looked different today? A cold case detective has to reconstruct the geography of a vanished world. The road signs may have changed. Businesses may have disappeared. Buildings may have been demolished. But the landscape often leaves traces. A road remains. A river remains. A street remains. A distance remains. Those details can help investigators rebuild a timeline. And timelines matter because people cannot be in two places at once. If a suspect can be placed somewhere else, the theory weakens. If the suspect's movements fit, investigators have a reason to continue. That was why Stanley's history mattered. Not simply because of his criminal record. Because investigators needed to know where he was, what he was doing, who he knew, and whether his life intersected with the victim's. The informant's claim had created the direction. The investigation had to create the proof. That distinction remained critical. There was no shortcut. No dramatic confession that could simply be accepted. No single piece of information that automatically answered every question. The detectives had to build the case one fact at a time. That meant going back through records that had not been touched in years. Some reports contained information about people who had disappeared from the investigation. Some contained names that had never become suspects. Some contained statements that seemed insignificant. But insignificant details can become important when a case is viewed from another angle. A name mentioned in 1986 might mean nothing. A second reference in 1987 could make it interesting. A third reference years later could make it critical. That was the kind of pattern Pierce was searching for. He was not looking for one perfect clue. He was looking for independent pieces that pointed in the same direction. The prison informant was one piece. The earlier detective's suspicion was another. Stanley's criminal history was another. But the crucial question remained unanswered. Where was the direct connection to Kathy? That question kept the investigation from moving too quickly. Because a detective can believe something. A prosecutor can suspect something. A family can feel something. But a courtroom requires proof. That is why cold case investigations often appear frustratingly slow from the outside. The public sees a headline. Investigators see hundreds of questions. Every answer creates another question. Every lead has to be checked. Every witness has to be evaluated. Every piece of evidence has to be authenticated. And every assumption has to be challenged. Pierce had to do all of it. Meanwhile, the passage of time continued to create problems. Some people who had been young adults in 1986 were now elderly. Some had developed medical problems. Some could no longer remember details. Some had died. That meant investigators were working against a shrinking pool of living witnesses. Every interview had urgency, but urgency could not become haste. A witness who says, "I think I remember," cannot automatically become a fact. Investigators needed to know what the witness actually remembered. Was it a direct observation? Something someone told them? Something they had read? Something they had heard years later? Memory contamination is especially dangerous in famous cases. The more a story is repeated, the more difficult it becomes to know where the original memory ends. That was why investigators had to separate original statements from later information. The old reports became essential. What had a witness actually said in 1986? What had they said in 2004? What were they saying now? If the details remained consistent, confidence increased. If the details changed dramatically, investigators had to be cautious. That process could take time. And there was another problem. Some people simply did not want to talk. The reasons could be complicated.
Fear.
Loyalty. Embarrassment.
Guilt.
Distrust of police. or the belief that too much time had passed. But time does not erase responsibility, and it does not erase what families deserve to know. That was one of the reasons Pierce continued. He understood that the investigation could not depend on people suddenly becoming cooperative. Police had to find independent evidence whenever possible. That brought the focus back to physical evidence. What had been preserved? What could still be tested? What could modern science reveal? The murders occurred in an era when forensic technology was far less advanced. DNA analysis was not yet the tool it would later become. Digital databases did not exist in their modern form. Many investigative techniques that are routine today were unavailable. That did not mean the original investigators were incompetent. It meant they were working with the tools of their time. But a cold case detective has the advantage of the future. Evidence collected decades earlier can sometimes be re-examined with newer methods. A sample that once seemed useless may become significant. A fingerprint can be compared against databases that did not exist when it was collected. A biological sample can potentially be tested in ways investigators could not imagine in the 1980s. But again, the evidence has to survive. And not every case has usable forensic material. That uncertainty is one of the hardest parts of cold case work. Investigators may know that evidence once existed. They may not know whether it can still be tested. They may discover that something was never collected, or that it was collected but not preserved, or that it was preserved but is too degraded. Every possibility matters, and the detective has to find out which one is true. For Kathy's case, the old evidence had to be examined through that lens. What could still speak? What had become silent? What had never been asked? The same questions applied to Rhonda. Her body had been discovered on Kilvert Street. Investigators knew the location. They knew the body appeared to have been moved. But what evidence had survived from the scene? What had been collected? What had been documented? What could modern investigators learn? Those questions could not be answered through speculation. They required the original records. And that is why cold case detectives spend so much time reading. The most important breakthrough may not happen in the laboratory. It may happen at a desk. A detective reads an old sentence, stops, reads it again, then asks,
Why?
Why did the original investigator write that? What did they know? What did they assume? What did they fail to pursue? That question can open an entire investigation. Pierce's work with the Warwick cases followed that principle. He kept asking what had been missed. The answer might have been small. A person. A location. A relationship. A vehicle. A statement. Or the possibility that two cases had been connected incorrectly or not connected enough. The concept of linkage became increasingly important. Instead of looking only for similarities between Kathy and Rhonda, Pierce looked for the person who could potentially connect them. That approach changed the investigation. It shifted attention from the victims to the offender. What did the offender need? Access. Opportunity. Transportation. Knowledge of the area. And perhaps a relationship with the victims. The investigation had to determine whether Stanley possessed those connections. That was where the case stood. A suspect had emerged, but suspicion was not enough. Investigators needed to know whether Stanley had actually been in the places that mattered, whether he knew the people who mattered, whether his story could be checked, whether the informant's information could be verified, and whether any physical evidence could support the theory. Every answer would either strengthen the case or weaken it. That was the honest reality. The investigation could not be designed around a desired outcome. If the evidence cleared Stanley, detectives had to follow it. If the evidence implicated him, they had to follow that too. The purpose was not to find a convenient killer. It was to find the truth. That distinction was particularly important for Rhonda. Her case was still unresolved. There was no public proof that Stanley had killed her. There was no basis to declare that the two murders had been solved. The responsible thing was to keep the investigation open. And yet, something had changed. The name that had once been buried in the background was now being examined. The old files were being compared. The connection between the cases was being reconsidered. The investigation had movement. That movement gave the families something they had not had in years.
Possibility.
Not certainty. Possibility. Sometimes that is the first thing a cold case can give back. The knowledge that someone is still looking. That someone has not accepted the silence. That someone is still asking questions. For Kathy's family, that mattered. For Rhonda's family, it mattered too. Because a family can live without an answer for years. But they never stop wanting one. The years become part of the grief. A child grows up. A parent grows older. A sibling starts a family. Life continues around the empty space. Then an investigator calls. The case is being reviewed. A new lead has emerged. Someone has spoken. The family begins hoping again. And hope can be dangerous. Because if the lead fails, the disappointment is enormous. That was why Pierce had to be careful. He could not promise a solution. He could only promise the investigation. He could only follow the evidence. The case would either move forward or it would stop again. But he was determined to give it the chance. That determination mattered because cold cases can become buried under their own history. Every failed lead makes the next detective more cautious. Every dead end creates another layer of doubt. Eventually, people begin to assume the answer is gone. Pierce refused to make that assumption. He had already seen one lead return. Stanley's name had survived. The informant had spoken. The old detective's suspicion had resurfaced. The cases were being examined together. Those facts did not solve anything. But they made one thing clear. The past was still producing information. And if the past could produce one new clue, it could potentially produce another. That was the hope. The investigation continued. The files stayed open. The questions stayed alive. And somewhere in those records was the possibility of a fact strong enough to transform the entire case. The difference between a theory and a solution was still waiting to be discovered. Until then, Warwick remained haunted by two names. Kathy Perry.
Rhonda Travers.
Two women. Two murders. Decades of silence. And detectives still searching for the evidence that could finally tell the world what happened.